recognizes the ranking member for her opening statement. I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement. I yield back.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Distinguished gentlelady from California, Mary Bono.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Chair now recognizes
the lady from California is recognized.
I'm pleased to introduce Congresswoman Mary Bono, former U.S. Representative for California's Inland Empire and Desert Region from 1998 to 2013.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Hi, and welcome to Sagely Speaking. I'm Mary Bono, and I am excited to get right into a conversation with today's guest, who I think has made a big difference this week with a very powerful article that he had published in Rolling Stone magazine. And I know that I've been receiving copies of it from various folks in Washington, D.C., so it has gotten notice. But our guest today is Paul Solotaroff. Paul, welcome to Sagely Speaking. Rather than my filibustering much about your bio, can you just tell us a little bit your career? You're an investigative journalist, and then how you stumbled upon this story we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. I've been a frontline reporter on this colossal failure called the war on drugs for 35 years. I stumbled through a series of blind left turns into journalism, landed at the Village Voice in 1988, and within months was writing a piece that was really just a kind of shot in the dark about the first collateral victims of the crack pandemic, these 10, 12, 13-year-old boys who were kickouts from single-room occupancy hotels during that first huge shoulder of the crack pandemic. In any event, I spent months interviewing these kids who were trading, selling what they called survival sex for $5 crack rocks to married men driving home to their wives in New Jersey after their workday ended on Wall Street. It was so horrifying and so heartbreaking that I thought, well, I've started at the bottom. I will never see anything worse than what I'm seeing now. 10, 12-year-old kids with open sarcoma lesions on their arms and foreheads, having unprotected sex with married men, give you some sense of how desperate they were to stay high. And again, I thought, all right, it's all uphill from here. By the way, that piece was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, my first ever story, and had the collateral effect of bringing down the only nonprofit actually working the streets in those days, Covenant House, which, as it turned out, had been founded and run by a monster of a priest who was bringing these desperately needy children in through the front door and selling, pimping some of them out the back door to corporate donors. That piece really kind of announced to me what my calling was, which was to write about gross injustice, to go out and prosecute the profiteers of human misery, whether they were corrupt cops, crooked judges and prosecutors, the NFL. I broke the NFL concussion scandal. I broke the Walter Reed Army Medical Field Hospital scandal. I've walked thousands of innocent men and women out of prison, having proven that they were wrongfully convicted. Got the rapper Meek Mill out of prison after demonstrating that virtually the entirety of the Philadelphia Field Narcotics Unit had conspired to frame him for selling crack. Broke the Aaron Hernandez story. So when I'm not writing about the NFL and its horrible mistreatment of its brain-damaged veterans and retirees, when I'm not writing about the soldiers coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan with invisible war wounds, traumatic brain injuries that were going undiagnosed and untreated, I have spent the better part of those 3.5 decades really writing about this colossal policy failure called the war on drugs, which has grown our prison population by 1,000%, populated our prisons, jails, and county lockups with a population that's roughly 2/3 addicts, people in active addiction who are in prison for trying to stay alive for another.
Paul, you and I might disagree a little bit on the failed war on drugs and a conversation about, in my book, it's just not that simple. It's not that easy. There's a lot to delve into.
Sure.
But I know, I want to know what brought you to the story about Snapchat. But I also want to talk about, this did begin with prescription drugs. And this started,
Indeed.
so, with OxyContin, so the war on drugs rhetoric or whatever, excuse me, I don't mean to be offensive. I just think you can't simplify it as some people do. But this did start with OxyContin. This did start with people going, I've got a great idea. Let's make it easier for people. And so what brought you to this story? I mean, your career, what was going through my brain is I can't imagine where you've lived and worked and spent time with those stories and how disturbing they must be for you as a writer, as a reporter, to watch that happen and feel, I don't know if you feel powerless, but your words are your weapons, right? This is your call to action to people to wake up, know the story. So how did you get to this Rolling Stone article this week on Snapchat?
Well, let's begin with your brilliant signpost. 1997, the Food and Drug Administration made a catastrophic mistake. There's evidence to believe that there was money and influence involved in allowing the Sackler family to essentially poison America's suburbs and rural communities with an end-of-life drug, a hospice drug called OxyContin, which the FDA approved for everyday aches and pains, and then somehow dragged the American Medical Association into its web of fraud and persuaded physicians all over the country, reputable physicians and a lot of disreputable physicians, that they had a duty of care to treat what they called the fourth vital sign, which is pain, and to treat it as though it was a life-threatening condition. And so in the span of 5 years, we saw an enormous upsurge in addiction to prescription medications. We saw an enormous spike in the overdose deaths of people who had no history of drug abuse. We saw communities absolutely poisoned by the opening of what we call pill mills, by the arrival of quack doctors, chiropractors, etc. And I've written extensively about how the Sackler family essentially seeded the soil in America for broadband addiction in places where we've never seen addiction before. In affluent communities, in the farthest exurbs, in places where there was no history of violent crime, no history of broadband dependence on prescription medications. And what began to happen in the aughts was that the children of these mothers and fathers who were treating their knee pain with OxyContin, Percocet, Vicodin, etc., began partying with those pills. Friday night became beer and oxy night at frat houses, at high school ragers. And by 2012, when the DEA began its raids on these pill mills and quack doctors, this huge black hole in America's drug supply was created, a vacuum. And in the narco world, as in nature, a vacuum is an unbearable thing that's instantly met with a new drug. That new drug, for a brief time, for a couple of years, was black tar heroin from Mexico. And then El Chapo had the brilliant idea to begin shipping over 18-wheelers with bricks of heroin that was all or mostly fentanyl. And by 2016 or thereabouts, the heroin that entered the drug supply had no poppy base at all. It was strictly 3 precursor chemicals that make fentanyl and mixers and dyes. And that's when you began to see this enormous second wave of deaths in the American Northeast Corridor, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. Again, places where we'd never seen kids die in alleys. We'd never seen prep school kids die in the streets. Suddenly, these deaths were everywhere. Meanwhile, even as that fake heroin was not only entering, but completely dominating the American illicit drug supply, these, what I call white boy narcos, these one-off kids in rural communities were finding their way to the dark side, specifically to a site called Alpha Bay, where for a price you could buy a baby jaguar, you could have your spouse killed, you could solicit an act of terror, you could buy child sexual abuse material. But what all those 17 and 18-year-old boys were doing was entering the chat rooms for fentanyl, ordering a brick of pure fentanyl from one of the 150,000 unlicensed chemical manufacturers in Wuhan province alone in China, having it delivered to their doorstep, and going to Amazon, spending $550 on a manual hand-crank pill press, and pumping out dead-perfect replicas of OxyContin, Adderall, Valium, Xanax, and selling them as legitimate pharmaceuticals on the dark web. They mostly wound up making their millions selling to other dealers around the country until in 2018, they began marketing these fake pills where every kid in America could see them on social media platforms. So Instagram and Snapchat were the two big landing spots for dealers of fake pills. However, dealers of fake pills quickly realized there was an important difference between the two platforms. Instagram kept and archived communications between drug dealers and their clients. Snapchat wiped them within 24 hours on the front end, and on its server farms, 30 days, meaning there were no breadcrumbs, no evidence trail for local police, for county sheriffs, for the DEA to track. In short, Snapchat, again, this is coming to me by way of more than a dozen senior law enforcement officers, DOJ officials, 2 county sheriffs, and their senior deputies. Snapchat became the eBay for marketing fake prescription pills to children. And then the last thing I'll say is that this migration from street corners and schoolyards to social media was gradual up until March 17th of 2020, when the pandemic locked everyone down, including the drug dealers. And so they went where all the kids were. They went to Snapchat. And suddenly in 2020, we saw a tsunami of dead children. Children who were the most high-achieving kids in their class, the most sensitive, the most intellectually curious, the kids who were going to go on and do extraordinary things, the kids we could least afford to lose. Their mothers were walking down the hall, that dreadful 20-foot walk from their bedroom to their kid's bedroom to knock on their child's door, get no response, open the door, and find their beautiful 14-year-old in what cops and feds call the fentanyl death pose. Blue-lipped, bile on their lips, wooden chest, meaning the chest locks down, so if you attempt to apply CPR, you get no response. Those kids were dead 6-8 hours from taking a half a fake Xanax, half a fake Adderall. I know of a number of kids who split their first pill with a friend. One of those friends was perfectly fine, had an intense delirious experience, and fell asleep The other kid was dead within 15 minutes of respiratory failure.
Paul, I'm glad you brought up the 20 feet from their mother line. You have that in your article, and it stopped me in my tracks. I've been an advocate in this world on drug prevention for a long time, but that line you had in there, and it isn't anything I didn't know, but the way you wrote it was particularly powerful. We'll continue our conversation with our guest in just a moment, but I'd like to take this time to thank my sponsors, Tamarack Resort in Idaho, America's only ski, golf, and lake resort. Escape the ordinary and embrace adventure at the breathtaking Tamarack Resort, nestled in the heart of Idaho. Whether you crave the rush of skiing down pristine slopes, shredding the trails on a mountain bike, perfecting your swing on their scenic golf course, or diving into thrilling lake activities, Tamarack has it all. Experience the ultimate outdoor getaway with endless opportunities for excitement and relaxation. Book your stay now and discover the wonders of this magnificent resort. Visit tamarackidaho.com. Mothers Against Prescription Drug Abuse, driving solutions to prevent drug abuse and overdose deaths by focusing on prevention through education and awareness. Map to Action, dedicated to promoting smart policies that keep our communities safe and healthy. All of our sponsors can be found on our website at sagelyspeaking.com. And now, back to the show. Are you surprised that parents don't know about this problem until it's too late? We tend to see that all the time or run into it. We had a guest on the podcast recently who said he had never even heard of OxyContin until his son had passed from it. Isn't it amazing that we can't break through to people who need to hear this? And I want to hear how well your article is being distributed, because I think it's a typical Rolling Stone article, so it's not for the faint of heart. There's a few words in there that are, that is perfect for Rolling Stone, but probably not Time Magazine, let's just say. But how is that going? Are you getting that out there, the article?
Every time I drop one of these big bombshell stories, instantly it goes viral on social media. Instantly it goes viral on all the aggregators. Apple News, MSN.com, Yahoo News. This story has been buried. It has been shadow banned on all of the big four social media platforms, meaning when people attempt to repost it, to tweet it, to send it to all their friends, they find that it goes nowhere, that no one responds, that even those friends who get the article and read it and then try to pass it along to their network find that it is stopped dead in its tracks. I don't have the evidence at hand to prove that there is some kind of collaborative effort to block the signal for this story. I can tell you that in 35 years of writing blockbuster stories, none more important than this one, I have never seen a story hit more brick walls. That said, anyone who has read this story has distributed to everyone they know. Mary, I cannot stress this enough. No parent in America knows this about Snapchat, knows this about fake pills, until they find their kid dead in his bed, or until the neighbor does, or until it's their grandniece or cousin. It's a club you don't want to join. It is desperately important to get the word out that these sociopaths, these cartel adjuncts, and these lost soul losers who've gone into business becoming home chemists and stamping out tens of thousands of these fake pills for 4 cents, a fake OxyContin, that they turn around and sell on Snapchat for $30 a pill. A kilo of fentanyl bought for $5,000 from Wuhan province generates 500,000 fake pills. Do the math. 500,000 fake pills selling for $30 online? It's $15 million. It is the most enormously profitable disruption in the illegal drug trade we have ever seen. And I can tell you a couple of crazy stories. So in reporting this piece, by the way, 9 months of reporting a story, I've never spent more than 3 following a piece. In 9 months, I was able to track this back to the beginning, to 2014, when that first group of digitally savvy white boys in the middle of America's heartland began to migrate to dark websites, Silk Road 2.0, Alphabet, get their hands on a brick of fentanyl, and begin to pump out drugs that high school, prep school, and college kids would do. Nobody wants to shoot heroin as an entry drug, but anyone and any kid in America will take a pill if their friends are taking them. Or if, as during the pandemic, they're climbing the walls, they can't get out of the house, they're doom scrolling social media to 3 a.m, they can't get to sleep. You know, they're wondering if their lives as they know it are over forever. And so they were easy marks for these gangsters and cartels of one to sell to. And those kids, without any street savvy, without any history of drug abuse, were really the perfect market for a whole new wave of death. And we have seen a die-off of children unlike any in our history. There are children dying at rates that far surpass car accidents, gun violence, and COVID. We are losing tens of thousands of children. And again, these aren't other people's kids. These are everybody's kids. And these are the kids who haven't built up a drug dependency so they can survive what's called a hotspot in a pill. That is to say, a chunk of pure fentanyl that has not been ground down and evenly distributed. So it takes 2 grams of fentanyl, essentially 10 grains of salt, to kill you on the spot. But we're seeing pills with one half will have little or no fentanyl. The other half will have 20 milligrams of fentanyl and would kill a family of 4.
This is where fentanyl test strips scare me a little bit. Because are you testing one half of the pill, or, it just gets so complicated. But what is your view on what's happening in Washington, D.C.? And, the tech giants have extraordinary power and influence. And there's a bill, COSA, you talk about that has been languishing. I know that Majority Leader Schumer is trying to get it moving, but you would think that this would be a no-brainer. Is DC, what's up with I know the answer here. I think my opinion, but I want to hear what you have to say about the circus now known as Washington, D.C.
Let me start by tracking back to a question you led the interview with, which was, how did I find out about this? So I've been covering fentanyl almost exclusively for the last 10 years. But last summer, I got a call unlike any I've ever gotten before. So I've built up all of these contacts, all of these friendships in senior law enforcement, LAPD, DEA, Homeland Security, Customs and Border Patrol. Last summer, I got a call on the bat phone from a top Department of Justice official who was disconsolate, who said, Paul, we are losing thousands of children every year to fake pills sold on Snapchat. We can't do a damn thing about it. We can't get these kids open in time to preserve the text between dealer and kid. We can't get Snapchat to send us the data in a timely fashion that will allow us to build a homicide, or what's called death resulting or great bodily harm charge. That's a federal charge. Our hands are completely tied forensically. We're getting absolutely no cooperation from Snapchat, and we can't get any traction on a bill, either through Congress or the Senate, that makes it onto the floor for a full vote. And we turn to you asking for you to try this case in the court of public opinion. Do what you do. Do one of your 10,000 deep dive probes into what is the invisible pandemic, namely the addiction of and destruction of children in America by the cartels and by their conduit, social media, because nothing is happening. We can't touch these guys in civil court because Snapchat and all big tech is protected by an almost 30-year-old rider on the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which essentially holds all social media companies blameless for something that a third party, a user, does to another third party, a fellow user. Basically treats Snapchat, Meta, etc., like the phone company. Meaning, if you and I conspire to commit a crime on Sprint, we get caught, Sprint can't be charged as a co-conspirator. They're simply providing a neutral service. Well, that law, which the big tech companies have used as their legal fig leaf for 20 years now. Remember, that law was written before there was a Facebook, before there was an Instagram, and no sane congressman or senator would have voted for that legislation in 1997 had they known that 15 years later, every 12-year-old child in America was walking around with the entire internet in their back pocket on their smartphone. And so I wrote a story about the horrors of this unholy alliance between the cartels and drug dealers everywhere and social media. But what I wound up writing was a hero story about a militia of moms who came together, having lost their 12-year-old, 14-year-old, 16-year-old boys, realized they were up against a colossus that nobody could touch, and formed this army of parents, began to demonstrate outside Snapchat's headquarters, began telling their story through sobs, through wails on Capitol Hill, met with the DEA, met with Orange County Sheriff in Southern California, with prosecutors, and built this enormous upsurge in awareness, in outrage, and in energy for action. And what that resulted in was, first of all, a huge slew of bad press about Snapchat and its connection to fake pill deaths. But it also brought them to the door of a hero lawyer in New York named Carrie Goldberg, who was the only lawyer at the time willing to spend her own money and her own client hours trying to pierce the veil of Section 230 and bring a civil suit of wrongful death against Snapchat. She successfully recruited a second firm, which was much better funded, the Social Media Victims Law Center. And between the two of them, they brought this extraordinary landmark case into a courtroom in Los Angeles. And 6 months ago, an LA judge, a guy named Riff, Judge Riff, gave them the go-ahead to proceed to trial and establish responsibility and a fact base about what Snap knew, when it knew it, and what actions it did or didn't take to protect its youngest users. Snapchat immediately filed an appeal. We're waiting on the appellate court to render a decision, but presuming the decision is the right one and this case proceeds to trial, it will be the trial of the century. 64 families are suing Snapchat for the loss of their children, and their case is enormously well-founded and documented with police records, with autopsies, with data they were able to recover from their children's phones, with correspondence between law enforcement and Snapchat. It is the best hope we have of breaking through this stone wall that protects the big four social media platforms and finally imposes upon them the same responsibility that every consumer industry in America has. Imagine you're Ford Motors and your cars aren't moving off the lot, and you decide to save, let's say, $100 million on the 2025 line of F-150 trucks by installing inferior brakes and brake pads on those trucks. Well, the second that first crash happens and we establish inferior brakes as the cause for that accident, Ford Motors would be subject under what's called a legal duty of care, meaning the federal responsibility not to kill their clients. They would be held responsible in civil court and in criminal court for annihilation damages. Snapchat and its peers have no legal duty of care. They are the only consumer industry on the planet without a basic moral and legal responsibility not to kill their users. And it must end. Presumably, it can only happen with a bill like KOSA passing through the House and Senate. But there's been at least a 2-year hold on KOSA and 4 other bills. And you know this better than anyone, Mary. A hold is usually anonymous. We don't know who's placed the hold on that bill. We don't know why it hasn't come to the floor. If there's ever a bipartisan issue, if there's ever something everyone in America agrees on, it's that a company should not be allowed to be an accomplice to our children's murders.
Yeah, that whole procedure is specific to the Senate, and it was very frustrating for me because you don't know who's holding your bill up. But we had Chairwoman Kathy McMorris Rogers on the podcast earlier, and she spoke about her desire, her final, what she really wants to do before she retires is reform or repeal Section 230. And I think that was very encouraging. I think it's very daring of her. I think it's a huge hurdle, but God, I hope she succeeds because, look, we're talking about opioids and fentanyl, drug dealing, but we know all the other harms that come to kids too from social media, and that we sit idly by as tens of thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of kids have died from these preventable overdose deaths. So I would ask, the listeners, if you can, to call your congressman or your senator or write them and ask them to support the repeal of Section 230C and to support KOSA, which is KOSA. This is the first time I've actually called for advocacy for people to pick up the phone and call and do something. But this is, whether it's the court case or whether it's the change in federal law, this does need to be all hands on deck. And the mothers you're talking about, I've worked with since 2007. And what's so sad for me, and I know for these mothers now who you're working with and talking to, is how many more are we going to meet in the next 6 months, 5 years? How many? And that to me is heartbreaking.
Mary, I'm a cop, can't say where in California because they're chasing this kid very hard. He's part of a task force in California, chasing one dealer who has killed 20 children in the last 6 to 9 months. Imagine that. A mass murderer of children who is beyond the arm of the feds and local and state cops because it's so hard to build a case on disappearing ink, which is what Snapchat was built on vanishing content. They will get this kid. I'm confident of it. But what happens, Mary, is you never manage to build a case against the dealer for the murder of that kid. The best you can do is catch him dirty with enough fake pills to constitute narco trafficking. And in California, Section 47 has made this enormously challenging because it essentially decriminalized the sale of recreational use drugs. Well, there's nothing recreational about fake pills. Nonetheless, guys like AJ Smokey, Arnaldo 826, who murdered children in my story, are still out there because they weren't caught with 4,000 pills. They were only caught with 200 pills. 200 fake pills in Idaho gets you 15 years to life. In California, it gets you no cash bail, out on the street same day. So it is fantastically hard to build cases. What they can do is set up deals with these guys and bust them for major weight and then charge them with kingpin counts, which will send them to federal prison for 20 to life. But even that is enormously difficult. We're never going to arrest our way out of this problem. The best thing we can do is to create as much national awareness of this nightmare in progress and simply make it unprofitable for Snapchat to keep doing business as usual.
Before we lose you, let's get to how do we get your article out there? And now there's a paywall, and I understand the importance of supporting journalism and publications and writers like you. That's great. But how do we get this article out? How can we help? How can our listeners help? How can our network of nonprofits help and advocates? What can we do, please? Because this article has to be very widely read.
Typically it would be social media. It would be people blogging about it. It would be people tweeting about it. It would be basically thumbnailing the story if the paywall was defeating people from reading it. On the other hand, Rolling Stone is the last great bastion of serious and deep journalism, and you could do a lot worse than subscribing to Rolling Stone. You can always end a subscription after you've read what you've wanted. But unfortunately, I don't have, the magic key to create the free version that's widely available. That said, talking about this, telling people about this, blogging about it, podcasting about it. I'm doing as many podcasts over the next several weeks as I can because each of you is an essential voice, an essential pass-through to an audience of exactly the kind of people I mean to reach, which is mothers, fathers, people with grandkids, people with nieces. This is not 25-year-old kids dying. This is 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, children suffering from from post-pandemic depression, anxiety, ADHD, disconnection. These are the most vulnerable children in our country, but they're also the kids we can least afford to lose. They tend to be really bright, really curious. They have what psychologists call the ring of fire brain. They have a hard time getting to sleep at night. They have a hard time focusing on schoolwork. There's just so much going on in their brains, and it's not hard to understand why they'd want relief in the form of a pill. And it's very hard these days to get pharmaceutical medications from a pediatrician. They're very reluctant to prescribe it. And so kids are going to get pills wherever they're available. The problem is these ain't Valium, these ain't Xanax, these are poison. And they're poison the very first time.
Well, I want to thank you for your work, for writing that hard-hitting and interesting article. It's an easy read. I think once you start it, you're not going to put it down. I actually hope it's up for a Pulitzer for you. And again, hopefully we'll be back one day to debate the war on drugs, because you did just say one thing, though. Dealers should be held accountable. There's a difference between how we treat the dealers, and that's a part of the war on drugs, too. So one day we'll be back, but I want to wish you the greatest of success. And you have my phone number and email, so holler if we can help. Just thank you, and thank you for joining us today on Sagely Speaking. You're a force of nature for sure. I want to thank my listeners and thank all of you again, and especially our sponsors, Tamarack Resort in Idaho, Mothers Against Prescription Drug Abuse, and Map to Action. Please like, subscribe, and share the podcast. And if you have any thoughts or comments, or you want to learn how to get a copy of Paul's article, please reach out to us at hello@sagelyspeaking.com. And until we meet again, be well.